Good afternoon. Welcome to the Summer Academy for Policy Leadership and Public Service Online. Today is June the 27th, 2021. Thank you for joining us for our Youth Activism, Civic Engagement, and Public Policy Forum. This afternoon, we will focus on H.R. 40 and legislation advancing the movement for reparations. Dr. Javaro Russell, member of the Policy Pathways Board of Directors, will introduce you to our moderator and panelist.
We are delighted that you have joined us for the Youth Activism, Civic Engagement, and Public Policy Forum. Our topic today is H.R. 40 and legislation advancing the movement for reparations. I am pleased to have this opportunity to introduce our distinguished moderator, the Honorable Delores McQuinn, and our esteemed panelists, Dr. Thad Williamson, Dr. Iva Carruthers, and the Honorable Leo Bazile. Dr. Iva Carruthers is General Secretary of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, an interdenominational organization within the African American faith tradition focused on justice and equity issues. As founding CEO and trustee of SDPC, she has steered the organization as a unique, influential, and esteemed network of faith-based advocates and activists, clergy, and lay. Dr. Carruthers' past professional training and experiences include sociology, epidemiology, postdoctoral studies in biostatistics, international affairs, and African art. She is published in the fields of sociology, theology, and media studies. Dr. Carruthers is a frequent guest speaker before various national and international forums, including UN civil society forums. She has served as a consultant and delegate to many organizations in the public and private sectors. She currently serves as the lifetime trustee for the Chicago Theological Seminary and American Baptist College. And she is a member of the National African American Reparations Commission and is working on initiatives related to the UN Decade of People of African Descent. The Honorable Leo Bazile is a retired attorney and former councilman and vice mayor of the city of Oakland, California. He is a veteran of the United States Air Force and has continued public service as chairman of the Oakland Housing Authority Commission. He's also served as the assistant secretary of the California Resources Agency under Governor Jerry Brown. He also served as adjunct professor of political science at the Peralta Community College District. As a community activist and social justice warrior, Leo served as the president of the Black Students Union at Merritt Community College and Stanford University. He holds a BA in political science from Stanford and a JD from UC Berkeley. Dr. Thad Williamson is associate professor of leadership studies and philosophy, politics, economics, and law at the University of Richmond. He is a sought-after professor and civic activist. His research focuses on the intersection between theories of social justice and public policy, particularly as applied to urban politics and economic policy. As a recognized community leader on poverty reduction efforts in Richmond, Dr. Williamson has served as the lead author of the Mayor's Anti-Poverty Commission report, the first director of the City of Richmond's Office of Community Wealth Building, and as a senior policy advisor in the Mayor's office. He is the author of Sprawl, Justice and Citizenship, The Civic Cost of the American Way of Life, and co-authoring of Making a Place for Community, Local Democracy in the Global Era, and co-editor of Property Owning Democracy, Rawls and Beyond. His newest book, Community Wealth Building and the Reconstruction of American Democracy, Can We Make American Democracy Work? Dr. Williamson serves on the board of Richmond Opportunities Incorporated and the Richmond Public Schools Education Foundation. He holds a PhD in political science from Harvard University, an MA in religion from Union Theological Seminary, and an AB in history and religious studies from Brown University. Delegate Delores McQuinn is a native of Richmond, Virginia. She has been a trailblazer in local and statewide politics, serving on Richmond City School Board, the Richmond City Council, and since 2009 as a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. Delegate McQuinn is a champion for those who have been marginalized and underserved. In 2009, she patroned legislation in recognition of African-American cemeteries. She's an advocate for locating African-American history in the Commonwealth. She was the chief patron for legislation that created a commission to study the impact of slavery and its long-term impact on African-Americans in Virginia. That commission is charged with producing comprehensive reports to the General Assembly that include suggestions and recommendations which would remedy some of the disparities documented by the commission's study and research. The delegate also chairs the Richmond Slave Trail Commission, and she also introduced legislation to establish the Virginia African American Cultural Resource Task Force in 2017. She was also the chief patron of the Crown Act, which made Virginia the fourth state in the country to pass a law which prohibits discrimination based on natural hairstyles and textures. Delegate McQuinn is an ordained minister and assistant pastor at her home church, New Bridge Baptist in Richmond, Virginia. She's an international speaker, exquisite orator, a critical thinker, a change maker, a progressive policy advocate, a Christian disciple and faith leader, a cancer and COVID-19 survivor, a wife, mother, and an extremely proud grandmother, sister, and friend. And with that, I will pass the mic over to Delegate McQuinn.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and thank you, Dr. Russell. Dr. Russell, I can realize that you don't know how to follow directions, as I shared with you earlier, but however, we're going to keep it moving. How about that? Good evening, and Dr. Lucas, and to the panelists, Dr. Williamson, Dr. Bazile, and Dr. Carruthers. I am delighted to be here this afternoon and having a very, very important and engaging topic to talk about this evening. Again, it's my pleasure, and to the young people who may be listening in on and engaged from that aspect, we say good evening to you, and we hope that you'll walk away with great insight on this particular issue, as well as other issues that you will have an opportunity to hear. We have a star lineup today of the panelists, and we again are delighted that they're here to be a part of this. You know, I am always encouraged by when I see a new generation of leaders eager to learn and to continue to fight for justice and equity and equality. And it's so important that they are being groomed, they have role models, they're being mentored in terms of, you know, moving forward and using the tools that many of us have had in the past, but also building on those tools to certainly make advances for the various things that we are dealing with in our society this day and time. When I think about what they're doing, youth activism, you know, you have an opportunity, again, great models from the past, and there are those in the present, as well as civic engagement, learning much more about that, and public policy, which makes all the difference in how you advance in a society. But today we have an opportunity to talk about something that has been discussed forever, even since 1865, after the emancipation of slavery, when there was a promise and an order that the land be confiscated from the Confederate landowners to be divided up with the 40 acres portion and distributed to newly emancipated Black families. following Abraham Lincoln's assassination, however, the order granting, as all of you know, the 40 acres and a mule was swiftly rescinded and by President Andrew. And so the majority of the land was then returned back to white landowners. And so African Americans, Black families, again, have been living under great disparity and unequal playing field forever. And I think it's always been an opportunity we wanted the opportunity to have this discussion because we thought that it was absolutely necessary. As you look at our history, as you look at what is, again, the unequal playing field, the inequities, the disparities in every aspect that we have had to deal with. And so today, as we talk about this, I think we will have a great moment to have greater insight in terms of where do we go from here and help our younger generation to understand that. The history that we are talking about of House HR 40, a bill that was meant to address reparation on a national scale. The bill established the Commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. And the commission was actually put in place, and they said that it shall examine slavery and discrimination in the colonies and United States from 1619 to the present, and recommend appropriate remedies. It was in 1989 that it was first introduced by Congressman John Conyers, and Representative Sheila Lee Jackson from Texas sponsored the bill and continued to carry the torch today. This is a very important bill, and I think more so now than ever, we are beginning to have intense conversation, valuable conversation, and engaging conversation. Now, before we move into with the panelists, I just want to talk a little bit about the goals of HR 40. Again, is to establish a commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Secondly, it will examine slavery and discrimination in the colonies. It is also identify the role of federal and state government in supporting the peculiar institution, the institution of slavery. It also they're asking for it to identify forms of discrimination in the public and private sector, agreed against freed slaves and their descendants. Identify lingering negative effects of slavery on living African Americans and the society. Also recommend ways to educate the American public about the commission's findings. This is a complex issue, and I am confident that as an African American, as I've shared with many people, we are not interested in bankrupting our nation, but we are interested in making certain that our nation understand that African Americans have been bankrupt since the emancipation of slavery, our communities from every aspect. And so how do we address this issue? Now moving to our panelists. And I think to the panelists, the first question that I want to ask you today, as we look at this particular issue, we are finally having this conversation in reference to reparation. It's more prevalent than ever. And I guess my question would be, do we think that it is something that will occur to a degree on the federal level in our lifetime? And we will start with, we could either get voluntold or volunteered. Dr. Carruthers.
Well, when you add it in my lifetime, that's a challenge. So yeah. I think, quite honestly, I am not sure if we'll move to remedy as a federal response in my lifetime. I would like to think so, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that that happens. But I certainly think that we have reached a crescendo that historically we have not been at, and that the confluence of all the factors which put us in a better position to connect the demand for reparations, both at the local, state, national, and in fact, global level, are in place. And so I think the more we can amplify the kinds of collective voices that are represented by your leadership and are represented by the diversity of this panel, will speak to the possibilities for it to happen. And I keep the faith that it will so happen.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Carruthers. Dr. Williamson.
Certainly, and it's good to be with everybody, and especially you, Delegate McQuinn. Does such a great job here in Virginia. I am very hopeful that there is a lot more awareness and discussion of the very concept of the racial wealth gap and of wealth inequality in general. And I think to see lots of people, Cory Booker, Elizabeth Warren, most of the Democratic leaders have something to say about this now, and all of which understand that we have to do something different and dramatically different. Whether it's establishing a child trust funds, free college, the add-ons, early education, but also not leaving off the table this fundamental concept of direct payments to descendants of slaves in the United States. And that really is what makes reparations different in kind, and probably for some still more challenging. But I think with this huge change in consciousness we've seen over the last couple of years, it has so much more traction than in the past. That I'm very hopeful. Then this is a conversation we all might want to have. Is that the tricky thing is going to be whether it takes the form of what some call targeted universalist policies that benefit everyone, or it takes that more group-specific thing, saying that the descendants of enslaved people in the United States have a special, specific right to payment, which I personally support. But the politics of getting there and making it happen, I think, will continue to be a little challenging. But yeah, I'm hopeful, and I plan to live for a while. But I'm about to say I'm hopeful in the lifetime of everybody on this panel. So I think in the next 10, 15 years, we can really push something.
Okay. Yes. Honorable Bazile, Councilman Bazile.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Lucas for including me in this discussion, because as I said, very often you folks on the East Coast forget that there are some of us out West out here, and we don't get a chance to interact in all of your circles there. You all can run from state to state in about 5 hours, and we can drive for 5 hours in California and still be in California. So we don't get a chance to interact state to state very much. So I'm appreciative of the opportunity to be here. As to your question, as the senior citizen, I think, on this panel with all of the young faces and everything, I think that in my lifetime, I don't know, I'm 78 years old, so I don't know how much more time I have to see this happen, but I think in 20-year cycles, and I say 20 years from now, the generation that I heard speaking earlier on in this program are going to bring this to fruition. And so this is a great step. As someone who has been involved in this issue since 1960, I can say I've seen the growth of this movement, been a participant in it, and it is just a joy to see, first of all, the millennial generation that is coming on, and the fact that the Congress of the United States has finally taken this bill seriously, because John Conyers in 1989, when he put it up, I thought that, well, at long last, we'll have a chance to discuss this issue, because I knew the America that I grew up in was a racist country, and I still hold that view, and that they were not going to take to anything talking about race, especially the whole idea of reparations. because I was one of the warriors that had to fight to get people to understand that Black power was not about violence. Mm-hmm. Black power was about Barack Hussein Obama and Kamala Harris, but they didn't see that at that time, and they wanted to talk about the violence. And the same thing is happening today. As this issue now comes on the table, all of this stuff about critical race theory has come up to be another boogeyman to take us down a rabbit hole away from the central issue, and that is, should America pay for the slavery that it brought into the world? And that is, chattel slavery that was imposed upon us in the United States was a unique kind of slavery, and therefore it needs to be talked about. As an attorney, I'm familiar with the concept of torts, and that is, when you create an unreasonable risk of harm, you have a duty to restore somebody if your negligent behavior harms them. So clearly, we don't have to talk about the issue of harm. It has been settled. The question then is, should America pay? Well, that is the question that I want to try to address here in this session. And I'm just pleased to see all of the critical minds that are on this panel, and especially the people with all of the theological backgrounds, because I think that we have a purpose and a mission here in the United States, which was opened up to in the beginning, that say, we the people of the United States. In that Declaration of Independence, America set itself up as the model of how God can bring about his purpose, and that is of loving each other. And that America then is on this noble experiment. And I think that we as Black people have a special role in that process, and I would like to talk about that further. So at this point, I will yield.
Thank each of you for that. Now, I'm going to do something that I sort of skipped over. Dr. Russell, thank you. I'd already realized I had my legislative aide sitting here with me, and she sort of nudged me a bit. So I'm going to go back and Dr. Williamson, if you would just sort of share your perspective on this, from a economic, political, or philosophical perspective on this whole issue of reparation. And then we will go from you to Dr. Carruthers, and from Dr. Carruthers and Dr. Bazile, I want to call you doctor, but Councilman Bazile, followed by your opportunity for you want to share your perspective. Thank you, in that order.
Great, and I actually think it's great to hear everybody's perspective up front. So I'll take about 10 or 11 minutes. Is that okay, Delegate?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, and let me go ahead and share my screen here. And, let's see. Okay, everybody see this okay?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I teach a lot of undergraduates, and obviously people on the panel are not undergraduates, but maybe some in the audience are. So, but as I lay out some basic questions that I talk about, in my course on justice all the time, but they certainly are pertinent to this conversation. And one is the question of what do we mean by justice? And the second is, if we have an answer to that, really how much inequality can we tolerate as compatible with justice? Thirdly, what do we mean by wealth? And what are the facts of wealth inequality today, and how do they relate to the legacy of racism in the United States? And finally, what policies could be adopted to address wealth inequality in general and racialized wealth inequalities in particular? So we don't have time for the long conversation about what we mean by social justice. So I'll get straight to the punchline, just to have something to, we can discuss this and debate it all day long, and maybe we want to do that, but just to put something on the table, which is a just society at a minimum would be one in which all persons have an equal opportunity to flourish. And by flourish, I mean meet your full potential as a human being. And we all understand that requires support and resources to actually achieve. And secondly, in which one group in which no group actually dominates or is dominated by another. And we understand human societies are diverse and we're grouped all kinds of ways. And it's a problem if any one group predominates, especially with respect to power. And this kind of basic concept has been articulated, in more precise terms by John Rawls, a philosopher who I've written quite a lot about. He talks about just societies involving equal liberty, equal opportunity, and then limited inequality of outcome. And when we talk about inequality, so much of the discussion is about income, and there are massive income disparities by any category you want to pick, particularly race and gender. But we often, until recently, I think have neglected wealth, and I think wealth is a very important indicator because, first of all, it's a measure of economic stability. Losing your job when you have nothing in the bank is very different than losing your job when you've got 100,000 packed away in the bank and a house, right? And so having that stability, I think, is so important to families. But also, wealth gives you the opportunity to influence society, government, and politics, in a different way. So if wealth is imbalanced, society itself is going to be imbalanced from a social justice point of view. So let's look. At first, I'm just going to do this by class, and we'll come to wealth on the next slide. But as of now, the most recent data from 2019, the top 1% hold close to 40% of all net wealth in the United States. The bottom 60% holds less than 6% of this wealth, and the bottom 20% currently actually are negative. They owe more than they have. And another way to put this in terms of a particular family, if you're in the top 1% as a family, your average wealth holding is $27.6 million. For a family in the middle group, it's about $105,000. If you're in the bottom 40%, it's negative $7,000. And this gap between the top and the bottom has grown steadily over the last 30 to 40 years. Now, looking to what these facts look like in terms of race, we start first with mean or average income and wealth disparity. So, the income disparity between white and black families is a little more than 2 to 1. But you look at wealth, it's closer to 100 to 1. Okay, and then there are also discrepancies. They're pretty severe in the home ownership rate of whites as compared to both blacks and Latinos. Now look at median, where the person in the middle is. Again, it's a huge racial wealth gap here, where the median white family has about $160,000 net worth. Latino families a little bit under 7,000, black families a little bit under 4,000. And if you look at the percentage of group that has in that negative column, it's 1 in 3 for blacks, about 3 in 10 for Latinos, and 15% for whites. Okay, and I won't go through this. This is simply the same data depicted visually. It's interesting to look at that when you look at young people, folks under 35, before they have had opportunity to probably get a high-paying job or to have their, actually own a home and have it grow in equity over time. The inequalities may seem on paper small at that stage, but you see over the life cycle they really expand. And so for typical white family in the United States, there's a pattern in which you don't have a lot when you're young, but you go along as you get older and you end up having quite a bit. And what we're seeing, this data is showing, is that for families of color, but particularly black families, this is not happening to the same degree. So we need to understand and investigate why. This slide here is helpful if you look at percentages of people actually receiving an inheritance. So about 30% of whites say that they've already received an inheritance compared to 10% of blacks, and about another further 17% expect to, compared to 6% of blacks. And then the size of that expected inheritance is also bigger, for whites. If you ask the question, could you get $3,000 in a pinch from family or friends? Right now, 72% of whites say yes, 41% of blacks, 58% for Hispanic or Latino. Home ownership rates, again, you see here the pattern where people are more likely to own a home as they get older, but there again these racialized disparities. So how did this happen? This is a very, very short account, but basically to point to two things. One is basically the entire history of the United States, and specifically the impact of slavery in creating wealth that whites appropriated, and then the way that exploitative regimes didn't simply go away when slavery ended. It reproduced in things like sharecropping and various laws that became sort of the regime by which racial inequality got reproduced. We know about the Virginia Constitution of the early 1900s, which basically locked Jim Crow into place and was designed specifically to inhibit Black economic and political development. And so while many, I'm not going to even say all, but many of those laws and the books have been removed, there's never been compensation for the accumulated impact of the previous injustice. And moreover, even with the laws in better shape, there's a lot of racism and racially disparate outcomes and processes going on today. The second, so that's a very American-specific phenomenon, and as has been mentioned already, the chattel slavery that exists in the United States was a unique evil in a lot of ways, in sort of world history. But if you look at other capitalist countries, there's a second pattern that we've seen almost everywhere, particularly sharp in the U.S. and Britain, of greater inequality of wealth over the past 40 years. So for a while after World War II, it seemed like the system was becoming steadily more equal in terms of both income and wealth, but that has totally turned around since about 1980. So you asked the question, how could we impact wealth inequality? There's so many things you can mention, but I just list here 6 mechanisms that clearly are impactful over life cycle. If you ask the question, what's going to impact the wealth someone's likely to accumulate in their life? So the first most obvious thing is the family you're born into and the situation of the family that none of us control. It's sort of luck from the standpoint of the individual, but where you start, matters clearly. Second, early education is so important. We know so much now about brain development and how much takes place between ages 0 to 5. And we know many kids here in Richmond, they get to kindergarten, they're already behind, which makes it difficult on everyone. Quality K-12 education, obviously important. But then what happens after that? Do you have the support to go on to college, be it 4-year or 2-year, or go on to a training or career development program? In our society, the kids I get at University of Richmond, society is investing a lot in them, but we also know that their kids in the same city of Richmond, the same age, are getting almost nothing at the same age in terms of what society is putting into them. So that's another area to focus on. Fifth is, access to living wage jobs, not just a job, but they have to be able to have a career, to be able to say, I may lose this particular job. I may not like the boss may not like me. I may have bad luck, but I still have skills and a set of credentials I can fall back onto, so I know I will be on my feet. That is another thing, that we have to pay attention to. And lastly, there's finally the, wealth building proper, which is actually accumulating assets over time. And typically this happens through home ownership, through business ownership, which can happen, that's just happens a variety of ways, from owning a share of stock to owning your own business, to cash savings. So, I think a policy approach, we want to look at all of these things. And so I'll just list a few here, leaning particularly on the wealth building policies, because they have been relatively neglected. So I did start with finding employment and workforce development. The Office of Community Wealth Building, which I used to lead in Richmond, focuses heavily on this, so that people are getting not just jobs, but living wage jobs, but also making sure they have childcare and transportation lined up so they can be successful in that job. And I always, will give a shout out to education as an educator, but knowing again how important pre-K and access to college are. But then looking at some of these other things are relatively new in the U.S. policy discussion, which is, why not give every child at birth a concrete stake of wealth in the form of a baby bond that could accumulate, money over time. And I've actually written a piece up in one of those books that was mentioned, which talks about, depositing cash in each individual's account, every year until age 18. If you did that and you invested the funds, you could expect that everybody could have, $50,000 or even up to $100,000 of savings by age 30. Another thing to look at potentially is ways to give more people shares in companies. There's law around employee ownership at the federal level that could be expanded. We can make it easier for, say, businesses that are owned by an individual, and that individual's retiring, can make it easier to transition those into employee-owned companies, so that the people who live in the community can continue to have the jobs and now have an ownership piece of it. There's so many, I think, options to think about how do we broaden business ownership that actually would be good for the community. Now, and we could go on more in the details, but I'm just trying to flag this so people understand there's conversations going on all the time about each of these ideas. It was mentioned we don't want to bankrupt the country, and most of these proposals that they were talking about involve increased taxation of the top 1%, which to me is morally justified. Now, if you wanted to go, take these ideas to the maximum level, you're talking about a redistribution of about 10% of all wealth in society would be enough to give everybody, a stake of about $100,000 each. Most of the proposals they're on the table now, the federal level, are a little bit more modest than that, but that's okay, because if you put them in place over a longer period of time, that you eventually you get there. And I do want to mention William Darity. It's a really important book on reparations that people should read, From Here to Equality. And then Derek Hamilton is another younger economist who's been very influential in some of these policy debates. And I'll skip ahead here so others can speak, but I also say is that, wealth building involves other things besides just, bank accounts, housing, transportation, libraries, broadband, all the things that influence an individual's well-being as they live in their communities, I think are important and part of what I would call community wealth. So we have to look at all of them. Obviously, we have to look at procurement and contracting policies and who gets those, and there's many times opportunities there to broaden minority contracting, but also, contracts that go specifically to companies that are hiring people from low wealth situations. The environment is important. And then there's the idea that some are floating of either a guaranteed minimum income or a guaranteed federal job. That's another part of the policy conversation. So, community wealth building is a term I and my co-authors, also from Virginia, Corey Walker, formerly at Virginia Union, now at Wake Forest, and Melody Barnes of University of Virginia. We've been working on this idea of community wealth building that could be applied to all kinds of policies as a way to make sure that in looking at reparations, we're not just focused on the past, but we're looking at how future wealth is created and how to make that process more fair, which is actually in the long term just as important. So we talk about inclusive, meaningful participation of the community, establishing bold equity goals. We're not just here to do the same thing over and over. We actually here to move the needle, taking a holistic approach to wealth, encompassing everything that we've been talking about. And then lastly, at some point, you have to rewrite the rules to change who gets what, whether that's how you're doing contracting, how you're making it easier for a company to convert to employee ownership, how you're doing the tax system. At some point, you have to impact the dollars and cents, or you're just talking. So I've already talked about the difference between targeted universalism and direct reparations, and I'm interested to see what others feel about this. I do want to say that simply that these approaches need not be mutually exclusive. You could have policies that impact all groups, and you could have policies specifically for Black Americans. And I would also say is that, what's appropriate will differ depending on the policy setting and arena. And also, they can change over time as political opinion and political support shift. And Delegate McQuinn knows extremely well there are all kinds of things possible in Virginia now that wouldn't have been possible 10 or 15 years ago. And so who knows what's possible 10 or 15 years from now. So I would, admonish the students, focus first on what you think the right thing is and how to build support for it. Don't be put off that so-and-so says you can't do this right now because of politics. If you got the right answer, eventually the people and the politicians will come around. So
thank you so much, Dr. Williamson. Thank you. Dr. Carruthers?
Thank you so much, Delegate McQuinn, and thank you, Dr. Williamson. I am especially pleased to be here because we're speaking with young people, and that is a very, very unique and special audience that I not only have invested my life with in terms of the role of mentor, but I think it is so very critical. And Dr. Williamson, I thank you for the data that you have provided and the opportunity for us to jump from there into a deeper analysis that will move us to reparations. And so as I've listened to you, I think what I want to do is to situate and respond to what you said with two things in mind. One is to situate a Sankofa methodology and a requirement that we have to know our history in order to connect the dots. Because in the end, what's important is not just the data, but the questions that we ask, because the data informs us in a certain kind of way. And if I take away very quickly where we are with wealth deficits and disparity, we know that for young people, if they were to add another 15 years and project their life, they will see at our present process and rate of wealth extraction, Black community will be at a zero wealth position in 15 years. At the current rate of this wealth widening, even though we're in this prosperous community. And so I want us to think about the implications of that as it relates to this issue of reparations for the African-American community. I want to say to the young people that I honor you. I respect your intelligence, your spirit of being inquisitive and wanting to be heard. And I think that's very important, because so often we find young people who feel like they are not respected at the table of a think tank or analysis. And I want to encourage them to stay at the table and to continue to ask their questions from their lens, because you are the future. On May 17, 2012, the United States reached a point in which there were more births of children of people of color than there were children of white parentage. And what is true now is that at least 43% of millennials are now non-white. And now the majority of all children born will be a race other than non-Hispanic whites. And America's positive net population growth is going to be determined by immigration growth, no longer natural births. And Asians and Hispanics will be the largest immigrant group. Now, what that suggests is that America has responded and continues to respond to these trends of browning of America and its impact on the historical white domination, racism, national identity, and immigration, which is being revealed. It has been revealed for sure during the last presidency of President Trump, which was in fact founded on a backlash against a Black president, and a post-presidency, which now says that the current president is illegal. And this is during a time in which the demand for reparations has reached a crescendo. So what I'm suggesting is that we've got to understand the historical context in which we enter this conversation, and we've got to ask the right kinds of questions, I think, if we're going to get to justice. Not if we're going to get to a transaction of payments, but to a nation of justice. So, from a theological point of view and from a sociological point of view, I define reparations as a process to remember, to repair, to restore, rejoin, replenish, set right, make amends, and reconcile. And always, true reparations is a matter of justice. Reparations can never be reduced to monetary terms alone. To do so, in my view, makes a mockery of the significance of reparations as a process to remember the suffering, the healing from the trauma, to bring about justice, and the demand for payment for the harm that has been done. Truth-telling and confession and apology are the first steps towards identifying remedy and the concrete ways to move forward. And of course, we demand that you not do the violations again and offenses, and so there must be a promise of non-repeat. And I say that because so often I'm in conversations where those I am talking to or with want to move directly to reconciliation from a church perspective without doing all those other things. I thank you, Delegate Delores, for giving us the framework for understanding HR 40 and the importance of HR 40. And for us to underscore that the original HR 40 was more about study, but in 2017, some of us got together and we were able to inform the way in which that bill ought to be altered and begin to focus on remedy. And now we've got that bill out of judiciary, and that bill is poised to be passed in Congress, I hope and pray. So we in the Proctor Conference, and I as the Commissioner of the National African American Reparations Commission, have embraced a 10-point demand for reparations that includes a formal apology, the right for land and social and economic development, the right to have remedies that address what Dr. Williamson has talked about in terms of wealth redistribution, a strengthening of Black America's information and communications infrastructure, preserving sacred sites and monuments. And Reverend Honorable Delores, we thank you for your work, not that just began yesterday, but your intentionality behind this notion of sacred sites, et cetera. And of course, to repair the damage from the consequences of the new Jim Crow. But I think it is important for us to also ask the question and interrogate our remedies against the question of what is public policy and then what is reparations, because there is a difference. I'm reminded too, Dr. Honorable Bazile, I'm just 2 years younger than you, so I know this whole piece about separate but equal and Jim Crow for real. And I'm reminded of how we had this discussion 40 years ago, and a lot of the lottery monies were supposed to augment education. And instead of augmenting education appropriation, it didn't do anything but replace it. And that was because we had not raised this distinction between public policy and really remedy to address these issues. And so the historical footprints are important, I think, for our young people to understand. And I want to lift up and invoke the spirit of Mother Callie House, who was the mother of the reparations movement and founded with 4 other pastors what is called the reparations movement by the incorporation of the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association. And she said, we deserve for the government to pay us an indemnity for the work we and our foreparents were robbed of from the Declaration of Independence down to the emancipation. And so when we look at the role of the church from the first snatch, the complicity of the church in the transatlantic trade slave system, which was a global system, when we look at the complicity and the role from the Catholic popes and their edicts to Columbus's prayers, to the ships that were named in Christian traditions and consecrations, baptisms, etc. We know that the church and state were one and the same in terms of the harm done. So in 2020 at the Durban meeting, in 2001 at the Durban meeting at the United Nations, I presented and said a stolen legacy, whether this generation or the generations of my foreparents, is stolen nonetheless. And we as victims have no alternative but to seek restitution. How can the victims owe the victors? So I want to connect for our young people the fact that reparations in the United States is connected to global reparations, because we also have a continent that is strapped with debt, quote unquote, that is positioned as legal debt that they are repaying. And if they continue to have to repay, they will never be free. And so we have moved young people from the mother of the reparations movement to those who on our behalf went to the UN in 1946, some who declared genocide, to Queen Mother Moore, who in California was the one who in 1962 made a claim for reparations in California. To young people, hear this. Martin Luther King said more than I have a dream. He also declared in Why We Can't Wait, quote, while no amount of gold could provide adequate compensation for the exploitation of the Negro American down through the centuries, a price can be placed on unpaid wages. And then Dr. Williamson, you went to Union, you know Riverside Church in New York. And in 1969, James Foreman and one of my sisters in ministry, Yvonne Delp, walked that aisle with the Black Manifesto demanding $500 million for reparations. So all of that brings us to this moment in which Sheila Jackson Lee has continued to carry that mantle that John Conyers gave to her. But again, connecting the dots, we need to understand that this is not about just a President Trump. This is not just about this moment in history. 50 years ago, under Nixon, which was a precursor to the new Jim Crow and mass incarceration, President Nixon was the one who said that the problem is the Blacks. And the key for us is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to be so. And that ushered in this mass incarceration that we are living with. And if we fast forward from that Nixon edict to 2015, in which the Congressional Prayer Caucus, the conservative caucus, created the Blitz Project, which said they were going to take over through public policy, local and state houses of government in terms of a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which essentially was a response to the Browning of America that we've already talked about, have got us to this moment where we're now facing what we thought we would never face, which is, again, the right to vote and suppression systemic efforts to prevent us from voting, and the fight over the minds of our children. We actually have state houses out of the result of this intentional organizing on the part of the right. We have state houses who are approving textbooks only that say, young people, hear me, that Black people migrated here as agricultural workers. That has to be a part of the publication for those books to get approved. We were not agricultural workers, and we cannot allow revisionist history to say that. And so we must teach our children and ourselves, remind ourselves that Martin Luther King did say it was more than a dream, and that we need to, as we enter into this post-COVID-19 impact moment and the consequences of what Dr. Williamson has already given us in terms of this expanded wealth gap, we cannot forget that the wealth that has been created by those who have profited from the pandemic has been significant. And so we wake up and we hear this foundation has given this amount of money, et cetera, et cetera. That money pales in relationship to the amount of money they have made off of the pandemic. Yes, the US knows reparations is possible. Yes, the US has paid reparations to other individuals and classes of people for the harm they've done. and the US government chooses to do with taxpayer dollars whatever they want to do in terms of appropriations. And so we need you young people to continue to join us in this national and global movement. I thought about, what do I want to say to young people in terms of what you can do? You can call and text and write your representatives in support of HR 40. You can pay close attention to what you are being taught at school. And if your teachers are in situations where they're being told they cannot teach about racism and critical race theory, then that's okay. You do an assignment and stand up and you do it yourself. You look around and do the research, and you sponsor activities that can deal with the kind of thoughtful ways to have these conversations and to dismantle these systems. We need to together hold truth-telling commissions in order to educate and reaffirm the case that we honor and remember that the past is sacred and that we demand what we are owed. We need to plan additionally commemorative events like the ones we just did around Juneteenth, Freedom Day, but also connect that to the International Decade of People of African Descent and the March 25th day of International Day of Remembrance for Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave of the United Nations. Young people, use your social media power to make your voices heard. And most of all, hold tight to your dreams and envision and make realities the things that are in your heart that you cannot see. And that's what faith is. Remember that you were not brought here enslaved as the beginning of your history, but that you are from a global people who long before 1619 were sailing and trading around the world. We want you to know that you are the future of this nation and you matter to us. And always remember whose footprints you walk in, whose shoulders you stand on, the love and sacrifices, the blood and prayers that you are heirs to. This is a battle over your minds and your actions, your thoughts and your beliefs. Let us all remember that silence makes a mighty noise and non-participation is participation. You become a dropout and one that does not matter if you are a non-participant. I look forward to seeing you in the movement because it's time for us to turn it over. So keep pushing and striving, and no one can ride your back if you're standing up tall and straight. Thank you.
Wow, awesome. I tell you, from Thad to Dr. Williamson to Dr. Carruthers, you guys are really building it up, okay? Dr. Bazile, the Honorable Councilman, we turn this time over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much. I'm elated by this. I mean, I'm just, just swimming in all of this information that is going out, but more importantly, the fact that it's going out to young people. See, that we talk among ourselves as adults and peers, and we never really get out there and talk to the people in the community that we are trying to lead. And so more importantly, we don't even talk to the youth because we don't speak the same languages, and therefore we think that they're kind of lost. And the reason why they're lost is because they bring plenty of passion, but they bring it from out of school, meaning that they don't have that knowledge and wisdom that we are talking about here, and we fail to give it to them. That's why I'm so happy to see Dr. Polani rise up and doing what she's doing in terms of reaching down to the young people, because I wish I'd had this when I was 15, 16 years old as a way of going in. But much of what I came up with in terms of my focus was when I went into the military. And I was in the Air Force and began to think about things broadly. And that's why, I keep referring to the fact that you folks on the East Coast in the 13 original colonies seem to forget that there are some of us out here on the West Coast. But I am here to tell the young people that California is the bellwether state of the Union. Most of what people are thinking about these days, we thought about many years ago and have been working on it for a long time. I happen to be from the Great Bay Area, Oakland, California, Oaktown, as we call it, in contradistinction to the city called San Francisco. The town has been in the forefront of progressive activity for a long, long time, especially on the Black hand side. From C.L. Dellums, who was the vice president of the Pullman Porters. You know about the president of the Pullman Porters, but you don't know that we had a vice president out here named C.L. Dellums. You know more about C.L.'s nephew, Ronald Dellums, who's our congressman for 30 years out here. And now you probably know about Barbara Lee, who succeeded Ron Dellums, who is still part of that progressive thrust that we are a part of out here. And I think that progressive thrust has a lot to do with the educational institutions that we have out here. You have all of those colonial and other educational institutions back there in Virginia. So you have a deep well to draw from. But most of our progressive thinking and everything kind of emanate around our two focal points of the University of California at Berkeley and Stanford University. And God blessed me with the opportunity to go to both of those great universities. So much of what I'm telling you comes out of my years in the Air Force and dealing with people from other parts of the country. And that's what I think you young people need to do. Don't get isolated in your geography. Get out into the world. If you go to undergraduate school on the East Coast, come back out here to the West for your graduate school. Or if as we talk about the people in the West here to do undergraduate, go East and get your education. Or even better yet, as Dr. Summerskill tried to get me to go to Morehouse and go into the South. But I wasn't for the South because the South of my era was one that I didn't want any part of. And a lot of people migrated out of the South to get away from what was going on down there. And I recommend Isabel Wilkerson to you to read her books, young people, The Warmth of Other Suns, and certainly her most recent one of Caste, so that you can get an idea of what kind of life that Dr. Carruthers and I would living with, because the rest of these people on the panel are youngsters, so they may not have lived in segregation, so they don't know what we're talking about. But you may not know either, because I find it strange that you have to be introduced to Barbara Johns, and who's a young student right there in Virginia, and you don't know about Barbara Johns. So I know you don't know about her uncle, Vernon Johns, who was someone that you need to Google and look up and everything. So those are things that I like to cover in my discussion here about where we came from, because I am what was called back in those days a pejorative term. I am a militant. Oh, if you were a militant, you were somehow against integration or whatever. No, we wasn't against integration. We were for desegregation. And desegregation was something that would put us in line to be the American citizens that we were supposed to be, and in fact are, because our ancestors being born here under the Constitution are automatically American citizens. So what we want to talk about then is what the government's responsibility is to American citizens under the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which is what I think our struggle as Black people represents, that we are the true Democrats in the sense that we try to uphold all of those principles that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution talks about. And as you can see, we're still fighting that fight just to be recognized as citizens, because the only power that you have as a citizen and the only voice you have as a citizen is your vote. And without a vote, a voteless people is a hopeless people. And that's where we've been, and that's where we're struggling to climb up from, using all of the tenets of the Declaration and the Constitution. So the Constitution of the United States does not govern Leo Bazile as such. Leo Bazile can discriminate against people and do whatever he wants to with his property. I don't want any Nigerians or anybody else in my properties. Well, I can do that. But the Constitution says the government can't do that. The Constitution prescribes the government. It decides what the government can do. Well, you say, well, Leo, how can you discriminate against Nigerians? Well, the government says I can't because they passed a law that says the people have certain human rights and civil rights that must be recognized by everyone, and the government must participate in that, because if the government participates in my discrimination, then the government violates the Constitution. So the government then, if they give me a business license that I have to be a landlord, the government is complicit in my discrimination against Nigerians. And therefore, the government cannot do that under the Constitution. And therefore, we have to then learn what that Constitution is all about. That's why I think this whole idea of civic engagement is so important for you young people, because as we now see that American people are ignorant about how the government works and ignorant about what the government's function is. And therefore, they can be led astray by people like Donald Trump, who comes in with this autocracy as opposed to the idea of democracy. And so here we are then at a loss for having our citizens to be able to function. You say, well, why is that? Well, we have 330 million people in this country. And I'm going to be a little pejorative and a little bit ad hominem, as I have to be, because power concedes nothing without a demand. And unless you make a demand loud and clear, the media and the press would not come to our aid and put our message out there. So we had to call people all kind of dirty names and use foul language and whatever during the Black Power movement just to get the media to focus in on what we were talking about. And all we were talking about was self-identity, Black is beautiful, and self-determination. The right to be able to have our own voices and speak to our needs through our elected officials and everything. And so we started pushing for the idea of being involved in local government, because that's where we were in these urban areas. So the Black mayors was the thing that we started off with. And if you're from Cleveland and you don't know who Carl Stokes is, then something is wrong. If you are from Newark and you don't know who Gibson is, something's wrong. But you know about Harold Washington in Chicago because it's a big city and they can talk about that. So that's good. But we out here in California didn't have any local elected officials. So that's where the push was. And the push was to try to deal with local problems. And what local problems were we having? Same one we have in the day, the police. And that's where the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense emerged from Oakland, California, because it was the next phase of the civil rights movement, which was bogged down in the rural South. But when the civil rights movement tried to come up to the urban North into Chicago, Mayor Daley met them with his police force, who was as vicious as Bull Connor and all the other people that were attacking and putting suffering on the head of Martin Luther King and his people down in those days. So us young people in Oakland, California decided, oh no, we're not those rural type Negroes. We are urban Negroes. So we didn't go with the Prophet Martin, we went with the Prophet Malcolm. And Malcolm was the prophet of rage, urban rage. And Martin was the prophet of love and the prophet of peace. And that's all good. And both of those things are what we need in this day. We need to express that peace, that love, and that thing that makes us Christians, the true Christians in America, because these people that call themselves evangelicals have now been exposed to be counterfeit Christians, meaning that they are not real. They're not anti-Christ, they are counterfeit Christ. Okay, and they're preaching out there a doctrine that makes no sense whatsoever in terms of the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. And so that has been exposed, and you now see that. So you don't have to go with that. But California, 40 million people in this state. 40 million people in this state, 330 million people in the United States. 1/3 of them are damn fools. And I'm sorry to have to say that to you, but it's true. 70 million people have voted for a damn fool. And so I'm sorry. The thing speaks for itself empirically. So if 1/3 of America has lost their mind, the other 2/3 of us have got to stand up and put this thing right. And that's what your generation is called on to do, to be that generation that is going to step up and start making these corrections. And so going back to Callie House and all of the people that Dr. Carruthers mentioned and everything, you should go and look at that. But right now, the thing that I would like to spend the rest of my time is to give you some of my background so you can see where I'm coming from. As a law student, I took a class of slavery as a legal institution at Boat Hall at UC Berkeley. And slavery is a legal institution. You say, well, how could slavery be a legal institution? Because the English charter companies that got their charters from McQueen to go out and institute British slavery, guess who wrote the charters? Lawyers. So the legal people have been involved in this whole thing all along. We wrote the charters that said you could go and sail your ship down there, and the Pope gave you theological coverage to go down there and grab up people and bring them over to this nation that was already occupied by Native Americans. And so the legal institution of slavery, in studying that, we found out that, well, how can the legal institution and the other side of the legal coin, which is the lawmakers, the Congress is where we focused our attention on, and that is what can we do there? But the whole idea of the Congress is something that was pushed aside because everybody wanted to immediately go to the courts, you see, because we were law students, we wanted to focus in on the courts. Well, the problem that we had with the courts is standing. And the courts just threw out the attorney general's suit on the elections and everything. Why? Because they didn't have standing. So you have to have standing to sue. You have to be the person that has been injured, so that you then have reason to stand before the court and to argue your case. And so the courts have always threw out the reparations issue. Why? Because you don't have standing. Oh, Leo, you weren't a slave. You didn't suffer any damage or anything. Or the other question that people throw up, well, why do you want to make us pay? Because we didn't hold any slaves or whatever. And that's why I brought up, I'm glad that you all have brought up the term of white privilege, so that the immigrants who said, my grandfather came over from Europe and established his store, his haberdashery, and passed on that wealth to us. Well, because he could go and open up a haberdashery was a white privilege that he had as an immigrant. And I noticed that Dr. Carruthers says that the new influx of immigrants that coming into America are going to be mostly non-white, and therefore that whole idea of 2040 being an important date when America transitions into a predominantly non-white nation. Well, that 40 is very important, and from a theological point of view, 40 is very important in a lot of the theological ramifications that they are out here dealing with. So 40, HR 40 is the name that John Conyers gave to the bill. And that 40 goes back to our 40 acres and a mule that we did not receive that would have made us somehow economically viable. So we were never really made free. We were actually just turned loose. And being turned loose, we were turned loose with nothing, no economic base to stand on, except for what free Negroes had established for themselves during the course of whatever time that they were here. So that 40 is very important. It's very important because it branches into 400. And if you look at the number of slaves that were brought to the New World, probably about 12 million if we take the low end, and 100 million if we take the upper end. But the point is that only about 450,000, let's say 400,000, were brought to North America where we are. So that 400,000, in 1619, we started off with 20. Then we, at the time of the Declaration of Independence, we had 400,000 people in bondage. And by the next point of departure is 1865, when they took the census around that time as to how many freedmen they had out there, we were at 4 million. So that tells me theologically, if we went from 400,000 to 4 million, and now today at least 40 million, that tells me theologically that God is not through with us yet. That if we were going to be wiped out and killed, we could have been wiped out way back when. So all those people that want to try to send us back to Africa or wherever they think we can't come from, are sorely missing it, because we are Americans. And in fact, we probably are the only genuine Americans besides Native Americans in this country. All right, so
Dr. Bazile, yes. we're going, you listen, you're on a roll and we're listening, but we're going to want to sort of throw out several questions and to check with the young people who are there to see if they have any questions. And then so we can continue the discussion and engaging in the conversation. Okay. You guys have been, I mean, absolutely extraordinary in terms of information. It is being recorded, and I'm glad, because this is going to be one that we can all go back and study as we are listening to what you all are saying. It's going to be really impactful in terms of helping others to better understand the degree in terms of the whole issue of reparations. So I would appreciate at this time, if I think that maybe I can sort of start a question so that you can talk among, the panelists can talk among themselves. One of the things that, and each of you have said a lot about it, we are looking at policy pathway, and certainly thank Dr. Lucas for her vision for this program and helping younger, in the younger generation to understand how essential and impactful that policies are. I mean, and then giving them a greater understanding of it in much earlier years. And I'm like you, Dr. Bazile, wish I had understood it much earlier in life, as I have been given the opportunity to help put some things in place. But policy has been used in so many ways. It's you know, there's been a lot of great things from the local, state to the national level and even international level in terms of how policy, laws, and legislation have helped to guide, you know, communities, our states, and, you know, our nation. If there is, you know, helping younger generation, again, with the young people who are on this, you know, are listening to what's being said today, how do we help them to really grasp the understanding of how policies have basically most of our life are guided by policy? I mean, even if you think about your home, you know, what is policy? You know, there are certain things that say these are rules, everybody must abide by them. These are things a select group must abide by them. This is information. This is something that's implemented. You know, some people will have to abide by, some will not. As we talk about reparation, we're talking about slavery. We're talking about the Black Code. We're talking about Jim Crow. We are talking about how we have gotten here in terms of all of the disparities. You know, the inequities that have been created, the inequality that's been created, the injustice, all of those things because of legislation, policies, and policymakers who were sitting in chairs and saying, this is what we're going to do to either keep people down or to elevate them. Right. How do we help young people to understand how significant and important policies are as it relates to just life, period.
Can I?
Okay, and yeah, I hope I sort of was clear in articulating the question that I'm trying to.
Yeah, you are, and that is where I was going to end. Is where I was saying that we thought the courts was the remedy. The court says you don't have any standing. You got to go standing from the legislative branch. You can't sue the federal government unless it gives you the authority to sue them. People don't know that. So they said, go to the legislature. So that's where John Conyers comes in with his HR 40 as a legislative remedy. Before you can start making rules, and we as legislators, because you one and the other legislators on here know that we can't make rules until we get some data. We need some information on the rule that someone wants us to make. And so that's the first step, is gather the data so that you can pull together the data that will point the trend so that you can then make the policy or the rule that you want to operate on. And that's why this is so important, that these young people bring those young voices to the table about what the rulemaking ought to be, but not just the emotion and the passion, but the actual information that is real and sustained. And that's what I love, what is happening here, and why I wanted to participate in it. So it's legislation time, but before we can do the legislation, we got to gather the data so that we can argue the policy.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Carruthers? You're muted, Dr. Carruthers.
Thank you. Yes, and in addition to that, the way I try and look at it and get my students to think about it is a distinction between assumptions, policies, and practices. Mm-hmm. And very often we begin with practice, and by the time we are arguing against practices, it's too late. That we really need to understand that underneath practice are policies. Yeah. And underneath policies are assumptions. And so we can't just focus on policy unless we really interrogate deeply the assumptions under which policy is formulated. Otherwise, we get in the situation of playing musical chairs, where the policy games that we were playing and thought we had changed, we did change, but they were momentary. And so we go back and play them again. So when Honorable Leo said that there was something different between integration and desegregation, that was a difference in assumption. The one I know that people can relate to is this notion of the emergence of a good program called Head Start. Everybody knows what Head Start is, and Head Start is wonderful as a policy that ended up in practice in daycare. But we also have to understand that underneath Head Start was an assumption that Black people were deficit and Black children came with disadvantage. And so as long as that assumption undergirds the policy, then we are still at risk for the revocation of policies that are really going to make for permanent change. And so what I'd like to offer to that conversation and that answer is that we have to attend to policy for sure, but we also have to be very clear about the policies that are underneath that. And at this time in place historically, there are assumptions of a hierarchy of human value, which is white domination and white power is at the top and Black people are at the bottom. And there are assumptions of Afrophobia, which is Black people ought to be feared because of the browning of the nation and the browning of America, and we are a security risk. As long as those assumptions are in the genetic code, the memory, the fears, the emotional system of America as a nation and individual whites and Black people as individuals, then whatever policies we make are going to have limitations.
And I
think well, you, Dr. Williamson, why don't you go on? But I do want to come back to Dr. Carruthers' conversation on the assumption, because the assumption and the policies, because there was a lot of discussion on Juneteenth about this hierarchy, superiority, the inferior population, hierarchy, supremacist superiority. I think so. I do want to come back to that for a little bit further conversation between the group. Okay, that Dr. Williamson.
Yeah, sorry. So I will speak to Dr. Carruthers' point at the end, but on the question about how students should engage, I mean, obviously you got to read a lot. And if you don't know what to read, email me. I'll give you 100 books. But there's so much out there, and certainly the CAST book, but has already been mentioned, is a very accessible one by Isabel Sawhill, as well as our other book. But the second is, for those of you who are going to be going to a public policy class at one of these universities at some point, I mean, the bad news is you're probably not going to have a discussion like this in most of your classes, which is unfortunate. And what's going to happen is they're going to show some charts up on a board, and they're going to show some data, and there's going to be somebody there who knows a whole lot about statistics and computer programming and analysis of data. And you're going to be blown away, and you might be intimidated, as I was when I first saw this. And it's really important for you just not to be intimidated for very long, because you can do it too. And it's really, really important that people who know how to handle these big data sets are asking the right questions, because a lot of times they're not. You can do all the stuff technical, but are you actually asking the right, interesting question? So it's important, if you have any kind of aptitude for that mathematical, statistical side, embrace it. And even if it's not your favorite thing, do enough of it so you can at least be friends with somebody who can do it better than you, because then you can work with them. You don't have to be the all-star to work with somebody as a co-author or collaborator, and you can help them, right? So that's the second thing I would say, just as someone who's been through public policy grad school. The third thing, though, is you got to get involved. You won't understand public policy from the books, and even less in the computer. You have to go out there and get involved in a controversy. When you get on a disputed issue, you find out very quickly not only the size of the question, but all the players and how the system actually works. I mean, any question, I can say from experience, any question in Richmond will quickly lead you to a whole bunch of things about how the city works, how the state works, how the Constitution works. And once you've been in there a couple of times and you've been involved, then that puts you in position to be a leader, for the future ones, because you can help other people explain, here's how the system works. And then the last thing I would say, because it's Sunday, and also someone connecting to Dr. Carruthers' comment, is you have to have attention to the spiritual side of why you're doing what you're doing. Because if you're trying to do this work for policy and to advance justice, you're going to have to get yourself very fired up, very invested, very committed to make any kind of change. And unfortunately, you're going to lose sometimes, and you're going to be frustrated, and things will fall apart, and you'll be very disappointed. And that, in those moments, that's where you have to have that clarity about who you are and why you're doing this, to have the courage to keep on doing it. And actually, I'm not going to say it gets easy, but to lose is no big thing. You just come on the next one, but you have to be able to get over it and get over it. If you have that clarity about here's what I'm really doing, then it doesn't become about your ego being disappointed at all. It becomes about, hey, this is just a bump in the road. Let's get him next time. So I think that's actually very important, if you're studying public policy. And last thing, then I'll shut up for a while at least, is that, in terms of these assumptions, when we started the Office of Community Wealth Building, one of the things that made it unique in Richmond was that we had a group of low-income folks, mostly, not exclusively Black, who lived in public housing, who had been involved, who were at the table from the beginning, helping shape what we're trying to do. And that was so important in shaping kind of the mentality, because what we'd heard over and over was that certain agencies, certain programs treated people not in a way that respected them, and treated them all as like a problem. And so our perspective was that we're going to treat everybody as a person with potential, and you may have problems, but it doesn't make you a problem in yourself. And we wrote out a whole sort of charter about how we would behave as a new agency that said, first and foremost, we will respect everybody, and we will approach our work in a spirit of respect. And as I was hiring initial team member, after they got through the first round, I sat down with them and said, look, this is what we're really about. Are you on board with this? And the ones who jumped on it and who got it, those are the ones who came on board. And that's what made it, made it effective. But I agree that there's so much embedded racism that's unexamined, in the way we design our system, that you have to unpack it at the root. And sometimes I have no doubt have been guilty of unconscious racism or saying things I didn't understand the implications of, or what, how somebody might have heard it. And that's why you have to have that community part, where you have somebody who loves you and trusts you enough to tell you that you've done wrong, or you said something you didn't mean to, and for you to be able to understand that. So, and again, you don't get that from just being in the library. You have to get out there, be in the community to have the kind of community who can correct you when something like that happens.
Okay, wow. Just getting back a little bit. Thank you all. This is so powerful. I mean, just wow. It really is one of those. Maybe every Sunday need to be spent doing this, Dr. Williamson. I don't know if I could take it, but anyway, it would be good for the soul. When I was listening, I during the protest for the Black Lives Matter after the George Floyd's death and whatnot, there was many times I went out with the protesters. I was invited out. I mean, just didn't go and impose myself, but invited to come and be a part of what they were doing. And I looked at many of their, looked at the passion. I mean, and I think you may have said something about it, Dr. Bazile, in terms of how passionate they were, talked about, when they were out there protesting. But two things that I finally got with them, and we end up actually organizing a group called Black Coalition of Change, where it was the protesters, those who have been out on the street, the younger generation, and then some of us who have been involved for many years, who was much older, and we thought that where they could bring their energy, they could bring this innovation, this sort of level of intellect in looking at things differently. There was wisdom that we could bring. There was experience that we could bring to the table. And we saw that they needed so much of that. And we felt that we needed what they had to offer. And so we were able to come together and create this group called Black Coalition of Change. And we talked about policy, but I kept telling them, you know what, you have got to move from protest to progress. And in between the protest and progress is policies. You cannot, and so you can't come to the table. We want to keep everybody out who's over 40. We don't want to talk with them at all. I had one young person and about 28 years old said, well, we shouldn't invite elected officials to anything that we are having or we are involving ourselves in. And I looked at that, and this is just, sort of a commentary, but I looked at that and realized how important it is for all of us to understand that even if we had more experience and more wisdom, they have something to offer. We need one another. All of us need to be at the table to get to a place, particularly this bigger issues that's going to affect all of us in terms of reparation. How do we come together, join together? And I think this is what's happening today in many ways. Now, and you guys can respond to that if you would like, but the assumption in the policy, the dismantling of all of these things which seemed to be just this monumental undertaking, Dr. Carruthers, that we're looking at. We see it, we have seen it over and over again, whether, again, it's in the educational system, it's in housing, economic development. I mean, the housing redlining. I mean, it is these systems that have been put in place along with policies that have created this kind of oppression that have existed for absolutely forever. And when we talk about, when I'm looking at, you talked about the assumption, it basically was all mounted on the premise of superiority, white supremacy, this hierarchy system. We're white, and so therefore we're certainly much more superior. We are superior, and you are inferior because of the color of your skin. And so all of these other things are attached to that. You're less intelligent. You know the much, you don't hear that much, but all, and I'm going to say this, it was this statement, all African American, you know, they stink, they blacks, they smell because you are darker complexion. But all of these systems that were mounted against us. And this is what younger people particularly, and we are helping, but they're going to have to go in terms of looking at policies to help dismantle these systems, these ideology, that all of these things that have been mounted against African American as we move forward. If we're talking about, as we talk about trying to repair some of the damage that has been done, it is going to take dismantling of so many things. This is why I hope that as we are talking today, the younger generations can understand that this undertaking, it is not going to be easy. And even as much as has been done, for them to pick up the mantle, to continue to run with it, they certainly need to hear the voices of Dr. Bazile, Dr. Carruthers, Dr. Williamson, in terms of what you all bring to the table, and to help them to get a firm understanding of what they can do and what policies could do when you better understand the objectives of those things that could be possibly put in place to help, I guess, open the pathway or create a better pathway. I said a whole lot that time for, whatever. Just pick and choose from it.
Can I speak to the issue of hope?
Yeah. Oh, hope, keep it hope alive. Go on. Yes, sir.
Yes, because that's what I have. It's
yes.
Hope for those young people that we're talking to.
Yes.
That I know they're going to be all right, because
yes.
they're going to be just inundated with information and data that we never had.
Right.
And because it's right there at Google. I had to get on my bicycle and ride to the library or get my Encyclopedia Britannica or whatever. They can just Google and pull up things and have information there. So it's very important. So I just want to say, the movement that we were involved in, when I made the distinction between the two prophets, Malcolm and Martin, Martin was about protest. And that was the era that we were in. We were protesting. I used the bus as the example. Rosa Parks tried to ride the bus. And then the second phase came about where we tried to drive the bus. That is where we went into politics, where we could make decisions. And that's where we had our black mayors and so on and so forth. And now we've gone from protest to politics. And now you're right. We're now at policy, because we have elected officials like yourself and myself and others that are everywhere. And the beautiful thing about it, that's why I say I always throw where God is in this thing. Now, don't you find it odd that all of these urban areas around America are headed by black women? So guess who is on the ascent now to take this thing through the policy phase of what we're doing? All the way from Sheila Jackson Lee to all of the various mayors and everything. That's no accident. That's all a part of that 40s thing that I'm talking about, that is constantly weaving through all of this. So that's why I have the hope. I know that these young people are going to be that generation that in their 19 years old now, when they're 40 years old, they're going to be running this country. They're going to be the presidents and the elected officials and the mayors and all these kind of things. And they're going to be confronted with policy.
Absolutely.
And so the policy people that are going to be bringing the information may be like Dr. Williams said, they may be just a bunch of statistic people and don't have the underlying assumptions that Dr. Carruthers talks about and don't understand that, you know, white fragility or all the other kind of things that they're talking about these days when they come to the table. Well, you see these ignorant elected officials that we have up there now, is that they don't know what questions to ask the policymakers when they come up.
Yeah.
If their staff hadn't given them some stupid questions that they could set up and make for the local news back home, they don't know what questions to ask. And that's what happens in this technology thing. I don't know about this technology. And so I wouldn't know what questions to start asking people about regulating the technocrats.
Right.
But what do you do as public policy people? You regulate small business. You got you got a public policy degree from college, but you don't know anything about running a small business, but you are regulating them at the city council level as to how they conduct their business, you see? So you don't have the underlying assumptions that are involved. So went from protest to politics to policy, and I want to see it unfold.
Yeah. Let me ask a question.
Can I respond to?
Yeah, we're going to respond. And then one of the younger, Dr. Carruthers, but we have and several folks, so I think we have another 20 minutes and several individuals who have asked questions, younger people. We want to get to that. Okay. Thank you. All right, Dr. Carruthers, go right on.
So, yeah, and I think what I want to say will speak somewhat to the questions I'm reading in the chat. So one is, I think the other piece that you've raised that is really important is the power of language, and that we have to be very, very careful, sensitive, and intentional about language and the words that we use. So there are two basic points I want to suggest. One is that when we talk about the difference between desegregation and integration, for example, we were talking about desegregating power. We were talking about dismantling power. White people were talking about integrating us sitting next to them in a classroom, as though that was going to be the solution to our being, quote, deficit in our educational outcomes. Right now, when we put this in the context of reparations, we need to be intentional about talking about, when we connect it to wealth, to speak to the enrichment that has occurred, the unjust enrichment that has created the wealth. We need to talk about who has gained, beneficial gain. And we need to understand that sometimes English is not good enough. We cannot use Holocaust for our experience. Our experience was 400 years. It was a ma'afa. It was a great suffering. It was transatlantic. It was global. And so sometimes we have to use African constructs to express and define our reality. And that's the difference sometimes between knowledge and wisdom. I also used to do computer technology. And I just want to say that bytes turn into data, which turns into information, which turns into knowledge, but ultimately you need wisdom. And I suspect that if some of us were at the table before the construct of defund the police went out the door, some of us would have had to suggest, let us rethink what that one word is going to create versus is there another word we need to choose in order to further our collective interests? And that's the call for wisdom and the call to be intentional about language.
Wow. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely right. Listen, okay, let me ask the question that Odessa asked a question here, and Odessa ask, okay, I'm sorry. We scroll down a little bit. All right, I'm not doing something right here. Okay, statement. Okay. Where's her question?
I can read it if you
Go
like.
ahead. All right, that's fine.
Okay,
that's fine, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Polani, because I lost it. Okay.
This is Odessa. She says, speaking of hope, I would love to hear the panelists' advice on avoiding hopelessness while trying to address these complex and often distressing topics. There are times when I find it difficult not to shield my eyes from the news in order to protect myself from more pain, but I don't want to disengage.
Okay, anyone can, just, and I guess this is just a matter of trying to encourage her to.
Well,
yeah.
I'll speak specifically and suggest that one of the things we must always do is stay in community. It is very easy to drift into hopelessness when we try and do this work as a lone ranger.
Yes.
You cannot survive doing the work as a lone ranger, and you cannot give it 24/7 without self-care. And so those are the two specific things I would suggest that Odessa make sure she is in community where she can share all that she is feeling.
And our first session tomorrow at 10 students is on self-care.
Awesome.
So another question?
I think Dr. Williamson did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Carruthers has said. I mean, absolutely, both self-care and community. And I guess the only thing I would say is the fact that you're upset about what's going on in the world means you're healthy. The problem is not you. The problem is things are really screwed up. And so don't let it get twisted.
Okay. And it's been screwed up for a long time. And that's why the history is important, so that you can see the struggles of your ancestors and how they overcame, so that you know that this moment of despair that you're in, you will also overcome.
And it's been screwed up. We got in the fight because it was screwed up, and all of us are much older than any young person who's a part of this. But we knew that the system was not going to work for us, nor for generations yet to come.
Okay, we have a question from Sierra Lewis, and she asks, what advice would you give to the next generation of leaders?
The struggle continues.
Yes.
Okay.
Gabriel, statement from Gabriel. She just makes a statement. I think that the reason so many people, this is talking about don't want to speak with elected officials because they feel like they have failed. They see a lot of systemic problems and feel like they can't trust the system to do what needs to be done. Okay.
Power concedes nothing without a demand. Never has and never will. And when people get into power, they are put into structures. That's why Isabel Wilkerson's book is so important, called Caste. It shows us that we have a caste system here in America, and the politicians go into that system. And just like you all that go into the academy and all the other places you've gone, you conformed or you get put out. And if you don't believe me, ask Nicole Hannah Jones, that if you don't conform to what people in their institutions want, the institutions won't throw you out. It's called bureaucratic cleansing. They do that. So you have to go in with a thick skin and a determination in the principles that you believe in, and do not turn around. And then you will find that like minds will come together. It takes some time, but it will happen.
And I think it's a difference, and some of us have certainly dealt with things long enough to understand that many things takes patience. I mean, you can't go in with a sledgehammer and just beat it down. Sometimes it has to be chiseled to finally get to what you're trying to create. And so if it's not a swift, moment, it's not microwave. It doesn't happen that way. You have to, when I just was talking about, just dismantling these systems. These systems have been in place for years, centuries. And so to dismantle that is going to take continual time. So let's, just stay in the fight, stay in the struggle, and endure to the end.
And the people on the inside oftentimes need help. And so we think that we elect people and then it's okay. They're supposed to do all the heavy lifting. We have got to be on the outside continuing to agitate and interrupt in order to help elected officials stay accountable to the vision.
And it's like when Franklin Roosevelt was confronted by the people as president, he says, I understand what you're saying.
Right.
He said, now go out and make me do it.
Right.
So that's why you got to have movements out there, that you got to find people of like minds, and you come forward with your ideas. And then if your ideas are safe, then people will generally flock to you. But if they consider them to be dangerous, then you got to be patient and spend the time to show them that Black power is not about violence. Black power is about Black participation in the political process by which politics determines who gets what, when, where, and how much.
Okay.
Very good.
We're going to, I've been given some marching orders. Delegate McQuinn, your final comments now. So listen, I want to thank, these panelists for your extraordinary, your leadership, your insight, your wisdom, your experience. I mean, intellectually, what you fed us today. Thank you so much. And we certainly do appreciate it. I know that the young people who are listening on the other end are going to walk away with just such a wealth of understanding, wealth of knowledge. And again, we can't say thank you enough, as we continue to move toward this issue of reparation and making it become a reality, in whatever form it needs to be. But I know that it doesn't end. We continue the fight, we continue the struggle. God bless you and thank you for this opportunity. And now I turned it over to Dr. Lucas, this amazing, very capable, awesome, smart leader of Policy Pathway.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Delegate McQuinn, Dr. Williamson, Dr. Carruthers, the Honorable Leo Bazile. This has been empowering, enlightening, informative, and a call to order. And so I just want to say to Victoria, Fam, Selena, Alexia, Chase, Gabrielle, Jana, Justin, Khalid, and Robert, and I believe I have everyone who is enrolled in the program who's here right now, and Anaya. Please take this information and let it be the start of a new day in your life. You are here with Policy Pathways, with some of the best thinkers and minds, top professors and policy makers. You have a wonderful opportunity to speak with them one-on-one. And I would just say that we are just delighted to provide this experience for you. So milk it, take as much as you can from it, and then continue to move on. We will have, after this session, our capstone meeting. And so you'll hear more about your individual projects. But I do want to highlight, we have a few professors who are with us here today before I leave. We have Dr. Nana Durkee from Ghana, who is here with us. Hello, Dr. Durkee. We have Dr. Sheila Winborn with us today. Dr. Lanil Henderson is here, Ms. Leela Garcia, and Mr. Wayne Thomas. And we thank you and we look forward to seeing you over the next 2 weeks. All I can say is this has been truly a blessing, and we are honored to have had this wonderful panel discussion on HR 40 and legislation advancing the movement for reparations. Thank you and have a good day and a good evening. And our students and our capstone representatives, you will sign into our virtual classroom at 4 p.m. Thank you, everyone. God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.